Good evening. I'm Carla Hayden, Librarian of Congress, and welcome. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Because on this evening and on behalf of this great institution, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to Climate Change, Nature, and the Writer's Eye, the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction event honoring 2018 winner, Miss Annie Proulx. Now you can clap. Along with our poet laureateship, the Prize for American Fiction stands as the library's highest honor to a living American writer whose body of work is distinguished not only for its mastery of the art, but also for its originality of thought and imagination. It seeks to commend strong, unique, enduring stories who have told us something vital about the American experience. The prize is conferred each year at the library's National Book Festival, and last year I had the honor of presenting it to Annie Proulx. And if you weren't there, you can check out the webcast on www.loc.gov. And while I'm on the subject, let me tell you about the 2019 National Book Festival. It is on Saturday, August 31st. And thanks to our generous supporters and book lovers, some of whom are with us tonight, the festival remains free and open to the public. So, if you get there when the doors open, you can join me when the award for our next prize for American fiction is given. But back to tonight. Our own Maria Arana, literary director of the National Book Festival, and I have to say a guiding light behind the Prize for American Fiction, will lead the discussion. She'll be joined on stage with two other luminaries, and together they will engage in an expanded conversation about the settings, plots, and underlying conflicts in Proux's work, including her most recent novel, Barkskins, on sale outside, as it relates to pressing issues of the environment. As Ms. Proulx said herself, writers who use the wide palette of the natural world command an important vantage point from which to observe the issues of climate change, rising seas, animal and insect extinctions, or the loss of woodlands. And we count ourselves fortunate indeed to bring you this program, conceived of and starring our own 2018 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, the acclaimed author of Brokeback Mountain, The Shipping News, Postcards, and many other splendid works. So please join me in welcoming an American original, Miss Annie Proulx.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayden. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Maria Arana. I want to thank you for coming out on this first day of spring, when it's a lot lovelier to be outside. I also want to thank, before we get off the ground, a tremendously talented group of people, the Poetry and Literature Center of the Library of Congress, who has put this together. They run the Poet Laureate. They run the Prize for American Fiction, and I want to call out their names: Rob Casper, the director of the Poetry and Literature Center, along with his tremendously wonderful lieutenants, Anya Cratney and Ann Holmes, who have put together this program. I'm truly humbled to be in the company of the people up here on stage with me tonight. They're extraordinary writers, each of them from different corners of the literary universe. And first of all, of course, is the winner of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, which we're celebrating tonight, to whom this evening is dedicated, and whose work represents a magnificent body of novels and short stories and nonfiction. And I was very glad to hear tonight that she is carrying on a little bit more nonfiction than is usual. And of course, I'm talking about Annie Proulx. I also have an internationally celebrated novelist from India whose wide-ranging books, be they fiction or nonfiction, deeply explore the human condition, the realities of the world that we live in, and the foibles and failures to which the residents of this planet are often, too often, prey to. And I'm talking of Amitav Ghosh. We have a distinguished journalist and author whose work has done much to clarify the complicated questions of planetary history, ecology, and environmental science, and pulls it off in a wonderfully clear, lively, and engaging prose. And I'm talking about Peter Brannen, right here. We're all here tonight at Annie's invitation because we share a common concern, a passion that unites all of us on this stage, and it is climate change. We're here to talk about the phenomenon itself, and we're here to talk about the ways that writers have engaged it or not engaged it. We're here, too, to shine a very bright light on the work of Annie Proulx, a work that represents a kind of perfect nexus between the realities of the planet and the art of storytelling. Every year, the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction holds a spring event to honor our prize winner, but also to hold a mirror to some of the themes and preoccupations that lie at the foundation of a writer's fiction. This program, Climate Change, Nature, and the Writer's Eye, is not only inspired by Annie's work, it is largely curated by Annie herself. So before we start the conversation, a bit of housekeeping. Annie's list of recommended books, and they're all nonfiction books because very often fiction is grounded in nonfiction, and certainly that's the way this evening will flow tonight. Her list of books, of recommended books, is in the back of the auditorium for you as a gift to you, a party favor, if you will. And it's also in the book sales area and the book signing area. Please do pick it up. It's a wonderful list. And all of you should profit from it and make your, as Annie says, make your own library of wonderful books about natural history and climate change. We will also have a question and answer period, but it will be with cards. So I would ask you to, in the first 20 minutes of this program, to write your question, if you would, and your name, and perhaps your title, if that's important. And once you do that, I hope you understand that if we select your question, if your question is selected, then you will go down into the archives of the Library of Congress forever. Sorry?
The favorite natural history writers.
They're
Put on the card.
They're natural, yes, and exactly. Please put on your recommendations, your own recommendations. Annie's very right to say this, of the natural history writers or fiction writers who treat natural history in ways that have connected you in some way, in an unusual way. Please do that as well. We'd like to know that too. I don't need to introduce any of these people, but let me just say a few words about each. Annie Proulx was born in Norwich, Connecticut. She is the novelist of great renown who has produced, among many, Postcards, The Shipping News, Accordion Crimes, and of course, Barkskins, and wonderful story collections. My favorites happen to be Close Range and Bad Dirt, the Wyoming stories. She's won the PenN-Faulkner, the Pulitzer, the you name it, the National Book Award, and of course the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. Her concern for the environment, I think, rings true in all her works, all the way back to postcards, really. You can trace this. Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta. He is a producer of an extraordinary range of books, The Circle of Reason, Calcutta Chromosome, Glass Palace, Hungry Tide, the Ibis Trilogy, which is concerned specifically with communal violence and migration and forced migration, and of course the environment. He was asked to give what is the name of it?
Lectures.
Yes, the lectures, thank you. The lectures at the University of Chicago, very extraordinary lectures, and he chose to dedicate all of his lectures to climate change, and the book that came of it is called The Great Derangement. I recommend it highly. Peter Brannen, who is the son of a librarian, so we like that very much. He is an award-winning science journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, among numerous other publications. His book, The Ends of the World, the subtitle is Volcanic Apocalypses, Lethal Oceans, and Our Quest to Understand Earth's Past Extinctions, has been named one of the best books of 2017. And what is so important about it is that it offers a solid context for exploring the questions of modern climate change. The book concerns 5 mass extinctions that have taken place on this planet in the past 500 million years. Scientists now believe that climate shifts of this century, of the 21st century, have analogs in those 5 extinctions. And Peter is interested in deep time and will continue, I'm told this evening, in another book on deep time, and they're thrilled about that. I want to ask each of them, starting with Peter, to give us a little idea of their positions on climate change, the environment, and the work that they do. Peter?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm so honored to be here. The humanity and economy of prose and dark humor in Annie's writing has been something I've tried to emulate my whole career, so I'm just thrilled to be on the stage on the same stage as Annie. But yeah, I come to climate change from sort of a different perspective in that climate change is often talked about something that happens on computer models, and it's something that happens in the future, and it's all very theoretical. And for the past few years, I've been obsessed with this idea that comes from geology, which is that this is actually an experiment that the planet's run a bunch of times in the past. And rather than argue over the parameters of a computer model, you can go out to an outcrop with geologists, and they'll point out some dark line in the rocks and tell you exactly what happens when tons of carbon goes up into the air all at the same time. Sometimes it's completely catastrophic, and I think a lot of times the ways climate change is portrayed is that it's sort of going to be like our world, but there are going to be these gradations of sort of discomfort the warmer it gets. And what you learn from geology and from Earth history is that the Earth can be many different planets, and it's not going to be like our planet, only slightly less comfortable. For instance, for each degree Celsius of warming, something like 10 to 20 meters of sea level rise if you look in Earth history. So you see these reports by the UN where it's like a few centimeters by the end of 2100, and that doesn't seem that bad. But what we're really setting in motion is this planetary chemistry experiment that's totally unprecedented in the evolutionary history of humanity, and that you have to go back tens to hundreds of millions of years in the past to understand. So another example would be that we're predicted to have 1,000 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere by the end of the century, which sounds sort of abstract, but you talk to geologists who study the Eocene, and that's what it was like in the Eocene. There's 1,000 parts per million CO2, and you can go to the Arctic Circle in Canada, and you can find fossil rainforests and there were crocodiles and sand tiger sharks and palm trees in the Arctic at an atmosphere that's 1,000 parts per million CO2. So whenever you read, and there are these caveats in the IPCC, the UN report, where it's like, here's what our computer models tell us, but here's the X factor, which is paleoclimate, and what geologists will tell you. And it seems like the planet is way more volatile and more responsive to these kicks that we're giving it now than we tend to imagine. And from a writer's perspective, it's just, for me, it's just so evocative, the fact that you can go to the tundra in the Arctic Circle and there will be fossil tree stumps coming out of the ground, and you can see fossil crocodiles everywhere. And it sort of, for me, scratches the same itch as science fiction. To imagine our future, it's not just going to be like our world, only maybe slightly less comfortable. We're really, whoever, like the next president really is going to have an effect for tens of thousands of years. We're giving the planet a kick that really could send us into this state that's only ever really been seen in geological history. So for me, there's the scientific aspect to it, which I think is really interesting, and there's also, you really do need to use your imagination to understand what we're capable of if we sort of keep going down the road we're going. Mm-hmm. So that's why I guess enjoy is the wrong word, but I like writing about it. Yeah.
And you'd worry about it very well.
Mm-hmm.
Amitav?
Well, I'd like to say as well, what a privilege it is to be here with Peter, who's done such interesting and important work on climate change, and especially on the extinction events. And with Annie, whose work I've hugely admired from a distance for years and years, especially her deep attentiveness to environment, to history, to the circumstances in which human beings live. And I think it's really an act of extraordinary public spiritedness and generosity on her part to devote this evening, really, which is a celebration for her, to climate change. And I feel really honored and privileged that she wanted me to be here. So thank you, Annie, for that. So I'm from India, from Bengal, which is the largest, which is a huge delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. And in the year 2000, I started working on a novel called The Hungry Tide, which is set in the Sundarbans. The Sundarbans are the world's largest mangrove forest, and they're very low-lying, exposed to the sea and so on. And even back then, it became very clear to me that climate change was having an immediate impact right then. You could see the effects of saltwater intrusion. You could see islands going down. And, we often talk about the islands of the Pacific, and of course we should. It's horrifying what's happening to the islands of the Pacific. But, the entire island nation of Tuvalu has 10,000 people. In Bangladesh, recently, one island went down, half of it was submerged, and it displaced 500,000 people. The numbers are such in Bengal. I mean, we are really talking about maybe 100 million people being at risk of losing their land. Bengal is a very populous area. It's about 270 million people altogether. And of these, the great majority live within like 1 meter of sea level right now. And the sea is rising very fast, because actually along with the rising sea levels, there's another anthropogenic impact that affects these areas, which is subsidence. So deltas are subsiding at 4 times the rate of sea level rise. This is happening around the world, in the Mississippi Delta and the Nile Delta, in many of the most populous regions of the world. So, the UN regularly puts out these figures of maybe 500 million displaced or whatever. And, you often hear people saying, so where are they? Where are these displaced people? Well, I can tell you that they're all over. Within India, we've already seen mass displacements happening, people moving from one part of the country to the other, especially from eastern India. They've been moving into the west, which is somewhat more economically stable and prosperous. But you can also see these impacts in movements of people around the world. People don't often remark on this, but we talk a lot about the migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean, and we often think that it's maybe Iraqis or Syrians or so on. In fact, the largest numbers of arrivals, for example, in Italy across the Mediterranean, are Nigerians, Bangladeshis, many Pakistanis, for example. So you can already see these huge displacements underway, and you can also see the complete unpreparedness of the world at large to deal with this problem. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago even that the migration issue would essentially destabilize all of Europe, and in some sense also North America. And yet here it is upon us, and we are completely unprepared for it. We don't know what to do with it. And what it's going to do in the future, heaven only knows. But I think, just to come back to the story of the Earth, I think we humans are completely capable of destroying each other long before the Earth has to.
Thank you, Amitav. Annie, tell us some of your thoughts about this to kick us off.
I hope we have a chance to talk a bit about the Marshall Islands this evening, too, who have been hit with 2 huge catastrophes within the last 100 years. I know some people from the Marshall Islands, and where are they going to go? But what am I doing here? About 15 years ago, when I was living in beautiful Wyoming, where I used to hike and ski in that part of the Rockies, which was heavily clothed in lodgepole pine, I noticed that a lot of the pines were turning red, not a good sign. And I asked around, I asked some of the forest service people, forest circus as they rudely called it there, what is causing the death of the lodgepoles? And they said, oh, they're just a few old ones, they're sick, and it's different, the forests are fine, not to worry. But I drove a lot because I was between the little town I lived in, Saratoga, and Albuquerque, exactly 555 miles from my doorstep to the place in Albuquerque, a 9-hour drive. So I got to drive down the spine, and I could see for myself a lot of red trees. And I began doing some research, and I found that the Forest Service had been created in 1905, this beautiful organization that was going to care for the forests. And I found out that one of their first jobs was to replant all of the denuded acres that had been timbered out in the late 19th century in the Rockies. There was mixed conifer forest in those days, and it was cut and cut and cut. So the wonderful new Forest Service came out with guys and shovels and little seedlings, and they planted in neat rows hundreds of thousands of lodgepole pines. The life of a lodgepole pine is roughly 80 years. And so from 1905 to 15 years ago when I was looking, those trees were senescent. Yes, they were old, but they were also suffering the effects of a long drought, and the pine bark beetles had moved in. The trees were too weakened by the drought and their age to withstand and to muster their natural defenses against the pine bark beetles, and so they died. And the red forest gradually turned to gray, and many of them are still standing, waiting for the fire now. Around about that time, I moved away to the Pacific Northwest, where there are also plenty of forests still standing, quite a few clear cuts too. And there encountered an entirely different kind of thing. But I could not get over the feeling of all of those hundreds of thousands of dying pines, and I decided I would write a book this is about the time I was just learning something for the first time about climate change, and I knew I couldn't possibly write a book about climate change. It was too vast a subject, and I didn't know enough. I didn't know anything, and it sounded like a lot of people didn't know anything. Also, everything that you touch is connected in some way to climate change. So there was nothing I could write about that wouldn't lead me into this extraordinary labyrinth of one twisting tale after another. Some of that I tried to preserve in plots, but I chose the shortest, smallest period of time I could think of to show anything of change in the natural world, and that was 300 years. I couldn't make it any briefer than that. So I began with Maine and worked across North America and went to New Zealand, where I'd been many times before. They logged out all their fabulous kauri long ago. I wanted to add Indonesia and the Amazon, but the book was too large by then, and my editor was afraid. I was afraid, so instead of adding to it, I cut and maimed the book as far as I'm concerned. But we'll see what happens. It was an effort, not an effort that could ever succeed, but I wasn't smart enough to realize that at the time. I'm not smart enough to realize it now, but I'm not going to write another novel. I have not been able to get climate change out of my mind. It haunts me day and night. It's all I can think of. It's all I want to write about, because it's more than the elephant in the room. It's the room. It's there, and I'm curious in many different ways. So if I write about it, it will probably be in essays. Instead, I've gotten to be quite involved with citizen science, and those of you who know me, and there are quite a few here that I do know that I'm a bug for citizen science. Right now, budget is being cut for sciences quite severely. Scientists have had a hard time recently anyway, for the last 30 years. But with less money, there are less grad students and less people to hire to do some of the scut work. That's where the citizen scientist comes in. I myself am involved at this time in a fascinating experiment. I'm a researcher with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has started a new study of clamshells. There was great alarm about the tiny pteropods, a little tiny snail that has been showing signs of damage on its shell. It cannot make a proper shell. Something is affecting it. And people are thinking, what is it? Well, it's suspected that it's acidification, you've heard of ocean acidification. It's a very wrongly named process. It should be ocean alkalinity reduction. It's not acid, it's still alkaline, but it's just enough to bother a lot of creatures that live in the sea. So this experiment that I'm involved in with quite a few other citizen science people is to clean and weigh clamshells in the Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca area, which is where I live now, and do this every year for 28 years. And the PI, the principal investigator, will be measuring that against the ocean alkalinity, the ocean pH, let's say it what it is, pH, and to see what connections are there, if there are any. But the point that I make is, instead of giving up things to be a good citizen helping with combating climate warming, get involved in something that really makes a difference, that you can learn from, that's exciting, that's very worthwhile, with people who need your help. And I took a look, and I found that in the DC area, there are some very tempting projects looking for help. Monitoring rabbits and chipmunks, gathering data on springtime frog calls, watching for bumblebee queens, counting the unfortunate birds that have collided with windows, and Delaware has room for stream stewards, monitoring kestrel decline, watershed research, and counting fish species. Most of these help us learn where we are with regional climate change. And if you haven't ever done any citizen science work before, I think you'll be very pleased at becoming part of an extremely worthwhile project. It's fun, you learn something, and you meet some terrific people. So that's my message.
Thank you. Thank you. So at this point, would you kindly, if you have a question, pass it down the aisle so that the stewards can collect it. We want to start talking about the science itself, and then we will eventually move into how fiction reflects, mirrors, or absorbs the science and uses it in different ways. Let me start with you, Peter, and ask you if you would define for the audience the word Anthropocene. What does that mean, and what is the relevance of it in this discussion?
I might be the wrong person to ask on this because I actually think the Anthropocene is slightly overrated.
Oh, fine, good.
Yeah, I mean, so for the last 2.6 million years, we've been in this ice age that's gone, dozens of times. We've had these warm interglacials, and then for 100,000 years or 40,000 years, you're in this deep ice age where there's a mile of ice on top of Boston, and sea level's 400 feet lower, and then we come out into these warm periods, and then for some reason, for an obvious reason, all of civilization starts a few thousand years ago, and we call it the Holocene, even though it's very clearly this interglacial between this ongoing ice age. So if we weren't here, there's good reason to believe we'd be going back into an ice age sometime in the next few thousand years, where North American ice sheets would advance, and then the Earth would wobble a little bit, and then there would be more sunlight in the northern hemisphere summers, and the ice sheets would disappear, and then they come back, and so we're just in one of these weird little interglacials in this longer ice age. That if you scale that back even further, we're on this long decline from the greenhouse of the dinosaurs when CO2 was 1,000 plus parts per million. CO2's been going down and down to now we're in this ice age. And we're still in an ice age, which sounds weird because you don't think of this as an ice age, but there's ice on Greenland and Antarctica, and that's sort of a weird situation for Earth history. For a lot of Earth history, there wasn't any ice on the planet. So we're in this interglacial and a longer ice age, and we are currently injecting CO2 into the atmosphere at this rate that's only been seen a few times in Earth history. But we are at a subliminal time frame. I think it's too premature to say that it's an Anthropocene. So the idea that we're in a new epoch, I think, is both really optimistic because there are epochs in Earth history that last 46 million years. And we've been a few thousand years, we've done all this crazy stuff. And I think we more resemble an event. So there are things in Earth history that last hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years that we call events. Because geological time is so vast that if something doesn't last for a few million years, you say, wow, that was a weird little episode. And I don't think we've earned the right yet to call ourselves the Anthropocene. I think we're, if you're a geologist 100 million years from now and you stumble upon the layers of humanity in some canyon that's exposed at the surface, it won't look like, you will never call it an epoch. You'd think it has the same, you'd be able to resolve it with the same duration as like an asteroid hitting, basically. So I hope we're in an epoch where humanity learns to live in concert with the natural world, and that we go on to be stewards for millions of years, and that this really is the Anthropocene. But at this point, I think we haven't earned that right, and we are just this sort of completely out of control force on the planet that there are analogs to in Earth history. But yeah, I probably should have defined the concept of Anthropocene first for people who aren't familiar with it. It's the idea that we're in a new geological epoch. I think that's too premature and it's too optimistic. So that would be my take on it.
And yet you would say that we've had an effect on this planet.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You can see episodes in Earth history when tons of CO2 goes into the air in a few tens of thousands of years, which to a geologist is a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. So there's an event 56 million years ago called the PETM, that stands for something, but it's basically it's an amount of carbon that's equivalent to all the fossil fuel reserves in the world got injected into the atmosphere by volcanoes, it's thought, and then there were some feedback loops. But it was about the same CO2 amount that we could do if we burned everything. And that took place over 20,000 years, and it completely changed the world. There was a global coral reef collapse. It was like a lightning strike to evolution. You have all these new groups show up afterwards. But that was as fast as things happen in geology. And so we could release the same amount of carbon as happened in this completely crazy event in a couple centuries. So that's way too quick to resolve in the fossil record for geologists. This is as fast as possible. And to call ourselves this geological phenomenon an epic, for me, it's just too, I hope it's true. I hope we're in a new epic, but I think if you were a geologist a long time from now and you looked at the record of humanity, it would be a weird little layer in the rocks.
So if we are the bad guys of the planet, at what point did climate change become our concern? The first time I think I lodged the concern personally was reading Alexander von Humboldt, who said back in the turn of the 19th century that the massive cash crops that Europe was planting and the sort of monoculture of agriculture at the time would be dangerous to the planet. And he said this back in 1793, 1800. And then I think he was the first person also to say that the forests had a great deal to do with the ecosystem. And, but when, as far as you're concerned, now, Amitav, reading The Great Derangement, you call out a time when the volcano in Tambora in Indonesia. Tell us about that. Tell us about that moment.
Well, the Tambora event, this huge explosion, I think it was near Sumatra, it had this enormous effect. A huge amount of dust and aerosols were pumped into the atmosphere. That year, 1814, 1815, would become famous as the year without a summer. There were droughts. I mean, all around the world, harvests failed. People went hungry. But, in the annals of fiction as well, we remember that year because that was the year when Lord Byron went to Lake Geneva. And while at Lake Geneva, he met up with Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley. And it was a very strange time. There were these terrible storms. There was all this darkness. And one day, Lord Byron said, and he had his secretary with him as well, he said to them, it was raining terribly, and he said to them, let's all write a story. And he himself came up with the first vampire story, and Mary Shelley came up with the idea for Frankenstein. So out of this strange, climate event was born essentially modern science fiction. Yes.
A degree Celsius change, so we can look forward to stories that are like 8 times better than
Yeah.
But yes, there were famines and cholera breakouts, and they say that the Mississippi, or I think one of the rivers, began to run backwards or something for a period of time and created a lot of havoc. Why does the public, do you think, fail to grasp the importance of climate change if it does? And certainly in The Great Derangement, Amitav, you say that they do. Why is it that you think that the public is so slow to grasp this importance?
You know, I don't really know that the public is so slow. You know, I think that there's one sort of narrative which says people are in denial, people don't know, people don't want to accept the science and so on. But I think, and you know, I think that's in a way a comforting idea, because it tells us that, you know, we only have to tell them the facts and they'll wake up and they'll do the right thing. But you know, the much scarier thought is that in fact everybody knows. And in fact, I think that's the case. I mean, really, everybody knows. I mean, certainly in India, anyone I speak to, especially farmers, etc., they always will say to you, yes, the climate is changing, the weather is changing, nothing is predictable. Similarly, if you just saw what happened in Mozambique, their president, their ministers said very clearly that, you know, this is an effect of climate change, you know. So it's not that people don't know, it's what people do know, they want to package in a certain way, which works out to their advantage. And I think that is effectively what you're actually seeing.
Well, today, on the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, were, of course, the floods in Zimbabwe, the cyclone in Zimbabwe, the floods in Nebraska,
and Iowa.
Any number of, yes. And so, I mean, it's reported, Annie, but it's still something of a media failure somehow. What do you think?
Well, putting this list together, I didn't want it to be too much like Dante's descent into the inferno, which is why I urge everybody to make their own list. But there is a book on there that I'm really not able to speak about, and I'm wildly curious. Amitav has read it. The Kari Marie Norgaard, who is a sociologist at the University of Oregon, Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life. And I gather it's about, well, you can explain it better than I because you've read it.
Sure. Yeah, I think in a way this was perhaps the most depressing book I've read in recent times. You know, it's a study of a small town in Norway. She doesn't really name the town, she gives it another name. But it's a town that makes its living partly from winter sports. So the snow is disappearing, so they can't really have their winter sports anymore. At the same time, this town, the people there are extremely well off, extremely well educated, extremely political. They, at the drop of a hat, they'll march against racism, they'll march against inequality, they'll march against any number of things. And they're also extremely well informed about climate change. They have to be, because they're seeing, you know, all the snow disappearing. But they never speak of it. They never speak of climate change. They're never interested in doing marches for climate change. So, you know, that's what makes you realize that really, in a sense, this idea that we have that climate change is a cognitive issue, you know, that people just can't reckon with the ideas. I don't think that's the case. There is something much more profound over there, which calls into question really our ways of life and contemporary civilization in the most fundamental ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a question that can be answered, really. Don't look at me for any kind of answers, because I sure don't have them, and if anybody here does, sure would love to hear them. It's this chap, Lifton, who's on the list, Robert J. Lifton, wrote something called the Climate Swerve, and I'm not sure what he means by swerve, but I think I know. I think he means a sense of malaise, a sense of something not right that's in everybody, sort of just something that makes you uneasy. You don't know what it is, but it's there, and it's there all the time. There's just something that's wrong. Has anybody here felt that situation? That kind of thing? Yeah, it's a real thing. He calls it the climate swerve, and he has a rather detailed explanation of what he means by it, but I think he means that it's an uneasy feeling. We all know something's wrong. We don't know exactly what it is, and we sure as hell don't know what to do about it. So there we are. That's the ordinary person. There are persons who know what to do about it, but I'm not one.
A kind of awareness, yes. And one of the arguments, we were talking about this backstage, is that while people will say, while global warming, yes, is an important issue and a serious challenge, and climate change is something that should concern us, industrialization in the developing world has lifted a lot of people out of abject poverty. And so how do you argue that? Or how should we argue that from your point of view? Peter?
This is terrifying. It really is.
Well, I think there is something fundamentally unjust about the fact that
There's just not enough to go around.
yeah, well, the U.S. and Western Europe was able to industrialize by burning fossil fuel, and that why can't China and India do the same thing since we did it and now they're not allowed to? Well, yeah, if they do, it's the end of the world as we know it. So I think that's
The end of the argument.
there's a unresolvable tension there about the past few centuries and the next few centuries that we just can't keep burning coal, or else we are gonna kick the planet into this state that hasn't been seen in tens of millions of years. So I don't think there's any easy answer to that, and the sense of injustice about it is valid, but it's just the planet responds to atmospheric physics and simple chemistry, and if we keep doing it that way, then it's going to be game over.
If everybody in China has a car, we're in a very big problem. But why should they not have a car when everybody in this country seems to have one?
And who's to say that they're not going to have a car, or that they shouldn't have a car? That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We are increasing our numbers, this incredibly invasive species, humans, by 1 billion every decade. That's a lot of people. And it would be lovely if everybody could have a car, and if everybody could be warm, and if everybody had enough food to eat, and if everybody had peace and surety in their lives. But it doesn't look like it's going to shake out that way, and I sure hope somebody in this audience has the solutions. Think about it.
But I think that there's also a problem with the ways in which we think about wealth or the good life. I mean, that is really what is at issue. I mean, are we really saying that, we are so much richer than, let's say, the world of Shakespeare, just because he didn't have a washing machine? I mean, there are these absurdities, really. There's such a presentism about this, And that's where, when you think about Gandhi and the positions he took, which actually seems so shocking today almost. I mean, he was willing to say that, no, we don't want that way of life. That way of life isn't wealth. It's actually a kind of poverty that comes disguised as as an idea of wealth. But there is no one in the world today who can actually say that, except indigenous peoples. And I think it's worth remembering here. There was a very brilliant anthropologist called Marshall Salins, who wrote a wonderful paper called The First Affluent Society, and it was about the Australian Aborigines. And he shows that they had more leisure time, they had better food, they had better health, they had more fulfilling lives. So really, I think that is actually the crux of the issue, which is what is wealth? What is the good life?
Yes.
Let's shift gears now and talk about what we do as writers with this subject. Amitav, you have written about forced migration quite a bit, and forced migration, as we know, it can start with, in this country, of course, the famine in Ireland that brought so many Irish, the diseases and famines throughout Europe that brought so many migrations to this country. In the country where I was born, in Peru, the shining path, creating such terror throughout the countryside that millions of people converged on the capital. And of course, what did that do to the desert coast? Enormous impact on that. And there has been a lot of writing and fiction and nonfiction about this. Amitav, tell a little bit about your forced migration inspirations.
Well, you know, as I was saying earlier, obviously when your land is invaded by water, you are forced to migrate. The Pacific nations are also going to be forced to migrate. But, you know, I think I spent this a lot of time in these last couple of years visiting, you know, refugee and migrant camps in Italy, and actually speaking to a lot of migrants. And it so happens that by the accidents of birth, I speak a lot of some of the languages that migrants speak. And it's one of the curious things you discover, that people who write about migrants almost never know their languages. So you get a vision of these movements, such as, you know, they're seen from the outside like billiard balls, you know, who are just being impacted and they're bouncing off like that. But I think that's a profoundly wrong view, you know. You know, there is this aspect, the environmental aspect of migration, but there's another very, very important factor behind it, which is technology. You know, if you look around the world today, you look at any picture of a contemporary migrant, somewhere in the background there is a cell phone. And this is a very, very important aspect of these movements, because every bit of the journey is actually managed through cell phones. You know, the money that they pay to the traffickers, the ways in which they find their entry points. Most of all, you know, the whole idea that there is some place they want to go comes through the cell phone. So, you know, we have created this world where this technology moves goods around the world at breathtaking pace. What on earth made us think that human beings also would not move, you know? You can't move everything and not move human beings. So what I'm saying here is that, you know, yes, there are literally some forced migrations, absolutely forced, but there are also these other migrations which are actually an aspect of the acceleration that is itself causing climate change. That is, both climate change and migration are effects of an acceleration that has taken hold of the world at large.
Well, certainly your novels do explore that to a great degree. I was thinking back at fiction that actually does deal with climate change and the depredations that say that human beings wreak on this planet. And I actually went all the way back to the Bible, to Exodus, to the Old Testament, where the Old Testament God sends plagues to the Egyptians, and he says, and quoting God, says, "Go up to this land that flows with milk and honey, but I will not travel among you, for you are a stubborn and rebellious people. If I did, I would surely destroy you along the way." Do you think, Annie, that fiction about climate change and other environmental issues, and which you have done so magnificently, and especially most recently in Barkskins, can teach us or show us something that, let's say, scientific reports cannot show us?
Perhaps, and I think it depends entirely on the reader. I would be inclined to look more at film. Books are not what they used to be. When I was a young person, books were the indicator of a country's intelligence, culture, etc. But it's films now. People watch films and television, and I think that's where we have to go. Wouldn't it be nice if there were something about climate change that were like Stanley Kubrick's How I Learned to Love the Bomb and Stop Worrying, or whatever it was. What was it called? Dr. Strangelove. We need a climate change Dr. Strangelove. The film version, not a real one, please. So yeah, I would look at film. I would look at reading. This list is a good place to start, but make your own list. Write your own book, if it comes to that. It needs input from everybody. I mean, we can't just sit there and wait for somebody else to do it, because nobody's going to. We're just going to procreate. That's what we're good at.
Well, let me ask the science person in the room. Is there something that fiction and that the imagination can bring that the very writing that you do, which is science writing, cannot, or can do better?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that sort of narratives about climate change have been ill-served is the extent to which they're dystopian, obviously, and that the humans in them are not recognizably human. They're sort of just they're somber and dour and trudging through this post-apocalyptic wasteland. And the humans don't act like that. Humans find humor and humanity in every situation they're in. And I think a lot of sort of the fictionalized versions of what a climate change future looks like are sort of these almost like Victorian morality tales where people are just like, have all the joy of a medieval religious triptych, basically, rather than...
To the Polish for a good teacher about climate change. They are so great with a sense of humor. They've been through so much horror that a couple, I don't know if you saw Cold War, a film that was recently out. The couple who decides to have a suicide pact at the end, and they take a lot of sleeping pills, and they go and they sit on a bench by the side of the road waiting to die. And then they change their position. They get up and they cross the view and sit on another bench, and they say, well, at least the view's better here. And that's kind of a Polish, a mean, self-inflicting turn of the screw. It's a wonderful sense of humor, and I would hope that somebody Polish would make the T-shirt.
Well, I tend to think of science and fiction, both science and fiction, as sort of both striving to the same goal, and that is to uncover sort of universal truths, to get at something that's foundational, that is clear and true. Fiction strives to do that in a very different way, as does science. How can we get closer and closer to the truth? So it seems to me that, am I right in saying that a lot of this, shall we say, environmentally smart fiction might have begun with Rachel Carson in 1962 when she did Silent Spring, and it was at that time, I think that a lot of people's imaginations took hold as, look at this, it's going to waste, we're losing it, and imaginations were fired by that. Am I wrong?
No, not wrong. It's interesting, but that's not really why DDT disappeared from your friendly neighborhood shelf. It's because it lost its efficacy rather quickly. So it was the decision of the company that it wasn't going to be a big seller. And Rachel Carson just threw kerosene on the flames, but really there was a problem with the product itself.
I do remember that in about the same time, J.G. Ballard published his book. It was a sort of cataclysmic book called The Drowned World. Do you remember that?
Yes.
City.
Yes.
It was right at about the same time, and maybe it's the combination of Silent Spring and The Drowned World that have made such an impression on me. But of course, before that, there are many. I mean, you could say that Moby Dick is an environmental novel, could you not? You could certainly say that John Steinbeck's novel about the Dust Bowl is an environmental novel. You could say that. Sorry.
The reason why this time is different is because DDT and chlorofluorocarbons were sort of niche chemicals that there were replacements that the chemical industry had ready to go. And the project of civilization for the last 150 years has been to convert as much carbon in the ground into energy with this byproduct CO2. It explains why there's 7 billion people on the planet. It's what we do as a species. So it's not just some niche industrial chemical that happens. It's the central project of civilization for the last 150 years. And to tackle it, it really is, the Montreal Protocol, which bans CFCs and helped the ozone recover, is not a good model for how we're going to tackle climate change, which is why the Paris Agreement has been so ineffective, is because it's not something that there's a ready replacement ready to go.
And it's so complicated and interwoven. It's like your grandmother who's knitted this extraordinary, huge quilt, been working on it for years, and there it is. It's about 8 by 12 feet. And you have been informed that there's one knot in there. There's one of those stitches that if you can pull it out, it's going to make the entire blanket into solid gold. So pick the right knot. You don't know, it's all interconnected. You'll never know, you'll never get the gold blanket. Sorry.
Well, so if you look at, let's say, John Steinbeck or Upton Sinclair or Herman Melville, or look at them as environmental novels, or Sarah Orne Jewett's The White Heron, and this is a question that was handed to me by Rob, the head of the Poetry and Literature Center. Is there something you think that contemporary fiction, and you being practitioners of contemporary fiction, is doing about this subject that canonical fiction could not do, or did not do well enough?
Tearing our hair out?
Well, I actually think that there's a great climate novel has already been written, which is Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which is really it could be about today in some ways. But yes, I do, in my book, I look at the ways in which climate change is so resistant to the techniques of contemporary fiction. There are many aspects of this resistance, but I think one of the most important aspects is really that climate change is uncanny. We are surrounded by all these uncanny events, which actually we are at a loss to put together. That's one of the things which I think is most elusive in writing about climate change. But I do feel that somehow in 2018, something new happened in the world, which is partly that I think many more people began to see the urgency of the circumstance. But also, a very important novel was published, Richard Powers' Overstory, which really is an amazing novel and a wonderful book. But also, the reception of this book was very particular, Before that, whenever you had a novel written about, say, subjects like climate change, they would never figure in serious reviews like the New York Review of Books or whatever, They were considered like genre fiction, so not serious. But Richard Powers' book hasn't been treated like that at all. It's been recognized to be a major work of mainstream serious fiction. And I think that... But she was always hived off as a science fiction writer, which she bitterly resented.
Yes, but she was shoved off to the side as being not very important and not very good. But
absolutely.
She's great and she's important.
Doris Lessing, in the last years of her life, what did she do? She wrote science fiction.
Yes.
But it's, so I think it's not just the novels. I think it's how novels are read. How novels are received, how they're read, all of that matters.
Okay, that's good. That's on you.
You say something quite wonderful in your book, Amitav, in which you say that we used to be, as a human culture, enchanted with the storytelling of the Arabian Nights, of the Decameron, where things were so wildly unbelievable. The believability was a question. And people, it was an escape world fiction. And then suddenly we became very earnest about fiction, and that it had to be something we
Individual.
could recognize.
Yeah, there has to be a central person.
Right. And so that we have put ourselves in the hole, in a pit, as it were, to describe something like climate change, which is almost, to some people's minds, quite magical.
Yes, it's exactly as Peter says. The modern novel was really born at the same time as humanity launched on this project of burning ever more fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels and the novel seem to have this sort of mysterious connection. But I think it's worth remembering that there has been another era of climate change, which is major climate change, which is the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. And I find myself now completely obsessed with this period. Unlike a lot of writers who think of climate change as something being pegged towards the future, to me, it's the past that's really interesting and important, And if you look at this period, the 17th century, and the sorts of writings and the sorts of imaginings that come out of it, not just in the West, around the world, it's really illuminating and very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think people understand the extent to which climate is the fabric upon which all of human civilization's been woven. So the ancient Egyptian empire starts right after this period called the African humid period, where this savanna was green, basically. And it's thought that as from the early Holocene, there's changes in the amount of sunlight that comes into the northern hemisphere, and for arcane reasons, the Sahara dries out and becomes this arid desert that it is today. And it seems like one hypothesis is that as the Sahara dried out, people consolidated around the Nile at exactly the same time that the African humid period ends. And it actually, because people had to collaborate now and they all were in the same place, it actually launched the start of Egyptian civilization. And then there are later events where a big volcano went off somewhere on the planet and it might have suppressed the monsoon. And you see at the same time in Egyptian civilization, there are increased priestly decrees about how powerful they are and overthrowing of royal families and things like that. So climate has always been sort of the, you can tell yourself this story about how royal families wax and wane in these wars and these battles and things, but it's at a certain point we are sort of subjects to these larger forces that we're now meddling with.
So it's different now.
Yeah.
This time.
There is now this sort of efflorescence of fiction that proclaims itself cli-fi, climate fiction, cli-fi, eco-fiction, Anthropocene fiction, and something called solar punk fiction, which apparently deals with biotechnology and that sort of thing. So there is a sort of groundswell of people who are dedicating themselves to this. A lot of it is experimental, a lot of it is science fiction. Very little of it is literary fiction. Poetry, of course, is very aware of climate change, has always been. And art, yes. And of course, you see the concern floating around even when people don't write about it, as in Nabokov, who is obsessed with butterflies, and actually did the citizen science thing of finding out that the blue butterfly actually took the same route that the humans took when they went over the Bering Strait and came down, and that's why they're down in South America. And he discovered this, he tracked it in the way that you're tracking clamshells. And it became very much a force, although he didn't, it flutters through his fiction. It isn't actually a concern of his fiction. So when we talk about cli-fi, or we talk about solar punk, or we talk about these which are very concerned with actually producing something that is climate fiction, is it best perhaps to let it float through in a kind of subliminal way in one's fiction?
Yeah, people are thinking and people are writing about it, and who knows? It's part of the swerve, maybe.
Right.
It's part of the consciousness that something's going on, and any way that you articulate it, I think, has value. So whether I have to check up on some of this stuff. I have not heard of, what did you
Believe
call
it or not.
Solar punk? We're all dying to hear some or read some.
I want to ask now for the questions. If Rob could hand me the questions. Thank you so much. While I ask you, thank you, Rob. While I ask you, Annie, to give us a little bit of background on what inspired you and what was your, the point at which you sat down and said, damn it, I have to write bark skins and it has to be about deforestation and I'm passionate about this subject. What was the point that drove you to this book?
It really, literally was just observing, looking. I used to ski a lot. One of the reasons I lived in Wyoming was for the Champagne snow. I had 18 years of fabulous skiing on back trails that were never used. And I could go zooming through those lodgepole forests, whether there was a trail or not, because there was no undergrowth. They'd all been planted, and I don't know whether they trimmed it out or sprayed it with herbicide, but there were no undergrowth. And I became suspicious, and I found out something about the trees, and I thought about them, and I grew up in New England, where there were lots of trees once, and it just seemed like the thing to do because I was becoming aware of global warming, as we were calling it then, rather than climate change. And so it just happened, and it was a rewarding, fascinating, overwhelming subject for me. I really got quite buried in it for a number of years. I'm very curious to see what National Geographic does with it. They're making it into a series. And I'm glad it's National Geographic because there aren't many good forest places left to photograph. And they have great photographers, and they know all the right places, so I have hopes. We'll see. But yes, I decided, though, that writing a novel about climate change was beyond my powers. So I'm concentrating more on essays and, again, on observation. There's where I live now, there's a particular bluff, a sandy bluff, and down toward the bottom of the bluff is a band of peat, old peat. It's all flattened out and dried together. It's not like the fat, plump peat that you see the Irish cutters taking out. That's wet. And the stuff I'm looking at is ancient. And how it got there, where it came from, how old it is, well, I know how old it is. It's 151,000 years old. It's relatively new. So I'm very curious about it, and I will probably write something about it, but it won't be a novel. So it's kind of hard to make a strip of peat be your hero. So that, I'm experimenting with short story, again, short stories, and writing essays, that sort of thing. But I'm afraid to go near a novel again, not only because I'm old, but because the only thing I can think of is climate change, and I know I can't write a novel about it. So I'll be the one reading solar punk.
Well, here's a vote from the audience, somebody whose favorite naturalist is Annie Dillard, the Pilgrim at Tinker Creek.
Oh, lovely, yes.
Yeah.
That goes on a good list. That's a
Yes.
good one. I think she lives in the Pacific Northwest, too, but I've never met her.
Right? Yeah, a wonderful book. Here's a question. Much like humans and climate change, many of your characters don't fully grasp the consequences of their actions until they're forced to reckon with them. Is there a particular character from your work that particularly exemplifies humans' perceptions of and relationship to climate change? I'll ask this of both of you. Annie?
No.
Really not?
No, not in my case either. I would say that really, you can't, I think, set out to write a novel about climate change. I mean, climate change is so vast.
Yeah.
But it's also just the reality. So I think that, in a sense, is the problem with those genres that you mentioned. I mean, rather than treat this as the reality that we live in, they're trying to create a kind of projection.
Right. Right. It was like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's the after effect of the apocalypse. Yes. Peter, were you going to say something?
I was going to say I've met an actual person who I feel like exemplifies humans' relationship with climate change. And that's I drove across the country with this former oil geologist who, one of the sneaky things among many that oil companies do is that people who are interested in dinosaurs get degrees in geology, and then you graduate and they give you a 6-figure check and say, want to hunt for oil with Exxon. And so he went that route, worked on oil rigs, and then started learning from Earth history that there are these events, like this one in particular, the end Permian mass extinction, which was the worst thing that's ever happened. It was caused by CO2 and runaway global warming. He started to research this as a geologist, quit his job as an oil geologist, and now is getting his PhD studying this event and thinks that if we burn all the coal in the world, we're all going to die. But he still maintains, he still has a share or a partial ownership of a natural gas drilling rig in the country, because people are very good at compartmentalizing their lives. And he'll tell you the story of how it's a bridge fuel and people need this energy, and he's just sort of meeting market demand. And I think that's a great encapsulation of our, all of us are implicated in climate change. These lights are on, we drove here.
Right.
So
we are the culprits and the perpetrators.
Yeah, and yeah.
Your friend
exactly.
sounds a little bit like an Upton Sinclair novel.
yeah.
Speaking of culprits and oil geologists, New Mexico people have a very wry sense of humor. And some years ago, they have a good geology department down there, and some years ago, a trio of, before that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Albuquerque. To the east, there's the great stony arm of the Sandias. To the west, there are 5 cute little volcanoes, little black pointy volcanoes in a row on the western horizon. Everybody in Albuquerque looks at one or the other or both of them during the day. 3 oil geology students graduated from the University of New Mexico some years ago. And to celebrate, they had a wonderful idea. They loaded up an old Jeep with a number of old tires, and they drove out to the volcanoes, and they put the tires inside the caldera of 2 of the volcanoes, and they set them on fire. Back in Albuquerque, people noticed black smoke coming out of 2 of the volcanoes. They called the geology department, and there was hysteria. How did we not see this? What is it? And vehicles began rushing toward the volcanoes, and they met 3 shamefaced but grinning graduates coming down the hill again. So this is the kind of thing that you bump into every now and then with oil geologists. There's a sense of humor there. It's not quite Polish, but it's close.
Here's a question from someone whose surname is Savage. I can't quite read the first name. And it's a question for you, Annie. How did your childhood in Norwich, Connecticut provide you with a foundation for interest in nature?
My mother came from a family of amateur naturalists, My mother was greatly influenced by Jean Stratton Porter's Girl of the Limberlost. That was her favorite book. And she had an affinity for swamps. And when I was very young, she took me into a swamp, which was pretty interesting. She had no trouble leaping from tussock to tussock, but I was about 3 years old and I had a great deal of difficulty, and she'd say, "Come on." And I looked over at the next tussock, and there was, the entire swamp was interlaced with spider webs, and there was a very large one on the next tussock with the owner in residence. And I could see the center line that went down the middle of the web, so you know it was a garden spider. I didn't know that then, I knew it later. Which reminds me of another story. In Pittsburgh, a few years ago, I was at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and they have an adjunct out in the sticks. It's a bird banding station. I went out there to look at what they were doing, which is pretty marvelous on its own. But I also saw a testing site that they had for glass. Glass manufacturers would send these pieces of glass to them, and they had this long black tunnel. When they caught a few migrating birds, they would let them go at one end of the tunnel. The sheet of glass they were testing was at the far end with daylight showing through it. And the birds would be released at the other end, and if the birds were let loose, they would fly toward the light. And the goal for the glass makers was to have some kind of glass that deterred the bird, and they would veer away. The glass that worked had a design in it that humans could not see, like the garden spider's center line. And I read somewhere along the way that the spider had worked up this design in the center of its web specifically to keep birds from crashing into it. So you see how things get tangled up with each other. A childhood memory turns into a thing about glass testing in Pittsburgh. I mean, that's how life is.
That's wonderful, wonderful story. Here's a question from Eliza Hayes, who's 18 years old. Glad you're here, Eliza. She's a Colorado College student, and her question is, do you think technology has contributed to the disconnect humanity has with the natural world? How can we combat this amongst young people?
Yes, I think it absolutely has. I mean, people live on their screens now, you know. I often think, I remember in my book I write about this weird event in New Delhi many years ago when I was a college student. And I was walking down a street and suddenly a tornado came and I had the good sense to run away from it. But I think if today, I would probably have stopped to take a selfie.
So it's better. Things are better in that respect.
Well, you know, I can tell you I've met so many people who risked their lives on the Mediterranean. And when I spoke to them about it, you could see that for them, they thought that they were invulnerable, really, because their lives were lived, you know, on their phone. And I think this is something, a profound disconnect between people and their circumstances that's really entered our whole world. I mean, in effect, that's what climate change denial, if you like, that's what it is.
Yes.
Are you saying that your cell phone is a kind of armor?
It's more than that. I think you begin to dwell inside your cell phone. So that it's a very powerful technology.
Yes.
Very powerful.
You're not there yet.
Not quite. No.
Here is another suggestion for a naturalist, Wendell Berry.
Yeah, a good one.
Good friend, did you say? A good friend?
A good one.
A good one.
No, I never met Wendell Berry, no.
Indeed. And here's a last question. In addition to citizen science, how can we link effective fiction and nonfiction writing with truly powerful advocacy to create a global movement to address climate change. Well, that's a campaigner out there writing. That's a, how do we muster the writing forces?
I think you described that it's happening.
Yeah.
We're back
Well, Peter's
to
doing it.
solar
Peter's
punk
doing
again.
it,
Yes.
for sure.
Yeah, Peter's
Making us
very
more
important
aware.
because he bridges a chasm. I don't know how many of you here who are not scientists have ever wrestled with trying to read scientific papers, but it's hard. And most of the time you can't get them anyway because there's a paywall. But someone like Peter who can understand that material and put it into effective, interesting, and vivacious prose is very, very valuable, and that's what we're needing right now, are people who can make the bridge between scientists and the reading public. It would be a big, big help. So there should be special writing classes for that specialty. Take care of it.
Well, I think that that's a clear clarion call, if I've ever heard one, Annie, and may it go out into the world. I want to thank Annie for this wonderful collection of talent here. Amitav, thank you. Peter, thank you very much. Thank you.